Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the launch event of the final report of the Working Group on Unification Referendums on the island of Ireland. You're all very welcome. My name is Cathy Gormley-Heenan. I'm a member of the Working Group, former Deputy Vice-Chancellor and a Professor of Politics at Ulster University, and I'm your chair for this evening's event. As I hope most of you who have joined us already know, the Working Group is a project that examines how any future referendum on the constitutional status of Northern Ireland would be best designed and best conducted. The project is not looking at, nor does it take a view on whether such votes would be desirable or what the outcome should be if referendums were to be held. But we all recognise that such a vote could happen, whether individuals want it or not. This 18-month project is led by the Constitution Unit and involves eminent scholars from Northern Ireland, Ireland, Great Britain, and the United States. And the final report, which is the focus of our conversation here today, was published in late May. Now, for those of you who attended a launch event of the interim report by the Working Group late last year, this final report builds on and reflects on all of the feedback that we received in response to the findings of our interim report. And for those of you who are joining us again, who were at the launch event of the interim report last year, a warm thanks to you for all of that feedback. We have 5 speakers joining us today. We have Dr. Alan Renwick, who is the Working Group's chair and who is also Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit. And in alphabetical order with us, we have Professor John Coakley from Queen's University Belfast and the Geary Institute at University College Dublin. We have Sarah Creighton, a solicitor, writer and political commentator. We have Dr. Avla Kilmurray, the Migration and Peacebuilding Executive at the Social Change Initiative. And we have Patrick Maguire, the Red Box Editor for The Times. So what we'll do is we'll begin with opening remarks from each of our speakers of around 5 minutes each, followed by a discussion amongst our panelists for about 15 minutes or so. And that should take us to around 6:45. And then we'll use the remainder of the time that we have with you this evening for an open Q&A, which will be facilitated by Conor Kelly, who is the research assistant and the project manager for the Working Group. So if you have a question that you would like to put to the panel based on what you've heard this evening, or if you've already read our final report in advance of tonight's event and you've got a burning question already, please do write it in the Q&A function, and Conor will be able to select a broad range of the questions submitted and read them out to the panel on your behalf. I should say that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the Constitution Unit website and the YouTube channel, and the audio recording will also be available on the Constitution Unit podcast after the event. The session has already begun to record, and we hope that you might want to share it with others who have been unable to join us this evening. And with that, without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Alan Renwick, Chair of the Working Group. Alan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Cathy, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. My job is to introduce the work of the Working Group. To do that, I'm not going to attempt to summarise our report. It's long. You can read it or a summary of it on our website. Rather, I'm just going to highlight 3 aspects that I think give the essence of our analysis. So the first is that some features of the framework for referendums on the question of Northern Ireland's constitutional future are already laid down. We have taken the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of 1998 as the starting point of our analysis, partly to keep our project manageable, but also because deviation from the agreement is possible only with the consent of the kind of range of actors that signed the agreement in 1998 and have operated within its structures in the years since. And on the clauses relating to constitutional referendums, that just seems to us extraordinarily unlikely. So the agreement requires that a referendum must happen in Northern Ireland if it appears likely to the Secretary of State that a majority would vote in favour of Irish unification. That's a responsibility that the Secretary of State must take seriously and exercise impartially. The agreement isn't unambiguous, but our view is that a referendum is required for unification in the south as well. The referendums must offer a binary choice. The agreement says the people of Northern Ireland would choose whether they prefer to continue to support the union with Great Britain or a sovereign united Ireland. The threshold in the referendums north and south would be 50% plus one, a simple majority. And if that threshold were met, both north and south, then unification would have to go ahead. So these are all features of the existing framework that must be reckoned with. A referendum on this issue might have to happen. And if it did happen, it would have to follow these prescriptions. My second point, however, is that referendums on this issue would be complicated and they would be fraught with dangers. Of course, not holding a referendum, if the circumstances requiring one were met, would also be extremely dangerous. So in saying this, I'm not passing any judgment on the desirability or otherwise of holding a referendum. But it must be recognized that it would be difficult. One reason for that difficulty is that holding parallel referendums in two jurisdictions with different rules and conventions is necessarily complex. Another reason is that lots of issues would need to be resolved. If a united Ireland were to be formed, then decisions would need to be made about the constitutional reform of the state, the provision of public services, the terms of the transfer of sovereignty, and so on. We have found almost no detailed work on the options here, yet many of these issues would involve genuinely difficult choices. But perhaps the most important reason for saying that referendums on this question would be complex and difficult is that no perfect referendum process is possible. We evaluated possible processes against a range of criteria. One of these is that people should be able to make an informed choice. Another is that if a united Ireland comes about, it should be designed through a process that is as inclusive as possible of different viewpoints on the island of Ireland. We saw both of these as important for our broader criteria of securing legitimacy for the process and outcome, and stability, both while the process is underway and over the long term. But these criteria cannot both be fully realized at once. Enabling a fully informed choice means working out all the detail before the referendums take place. But at that stage, unionists would entirely legitimately be working out how to persuade a majority to vote for maintaining the union. They would be highly unlikely, we presume, to engage with designing a united Ireland. Conversely, if you delay design till after referendums and votes in favour of unification, greater inclusion may be possible, but a fully informed choice is not. There is no perfect resolution to this conundrum. Trade-offs would be required. We set out in our report 3 plausible ways in which the referendums could be configured, coming either early or late in the overall decision-making process. We don't, however, say which should be followed, because there's a genuine quandary there, and further wide discussion is needed in our view to work out what approach might be best. All of that leads me to my third and final point, which I will state very quickly. Referendums should not be called without a clear plan for the referendums themselves and the processes surrounding them. We do not say that detailed planning by the governments should begin now. It's clear that calling referendums on this issue is not imminent, but we do think that awareness and discussion of the complex issues that we set out in our report is important. So to conclude, debate about Northern Ireland's constitutional future is happening, and we hope that our report will help to ensure that it is informed as to what would be involved in making that choice. Cathy, thanks very much.
Thank you, Alan. And I think we'll come back to some of those points in your 3 highlights later in our panel discussion. But for now, I'll pass over to John. John.
Yep, thanks, Cathy. I'd like to start by congratulating those who produced this report for bringing together such a diverse range of perspectives in a coherent, innovative, comprehensive, and politically significant work. The report is rich in points of detail that are worth debating further, but I'll confine myself here to just a couple of general points, 2 general points. First, the report unambiguously corrects an emerging interpretation of the provisions for a border poll, an interpretation that seems to me to subvert mainstream understanding of referendums and their implications by introducing a qualified majority requirement rather than a simple majority one. The notion of a simple majority vote in any unity referendum was a critical element in the negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement. On the one hand, it assured unionists of their position within the UK for as long as this had majority support. But the referendum commitment also offered nationalists the prospect of eventual Irish unity should majority support for this be forthcoming. In fact, it's hard to imagine that Sinn Féin would ever have signed up to the Good Friday Agreement without this provision, because in effect, in 1998, Sinn Féin compromised on a crucial component in Irish nationalist ideology. It conceded that the counting unit in a referendum would not be the island of Ireland, where nationalists could outvote unionists, but the two jurisdictions on the island, each of which would have a veto on unity. Several nationalist political leaders, including former Taoiseach in the Republic, have distanced themselves from the central provision of decision-making by majority vote in a referendum, arguing that Irish unity should require a majority larger than 50%. A former Northern Ireland Deputy First Minister, the late Seamus Mallon, went further than this, suggesting that unionist consent to change should also be a requirement. To dissent from these revisionist views is not to argue that we should push ahead with a majoritarian border poll, which indeed might be quite counterproductive from the perspective of those advocating this route to Irish unity right now. The UCL report is neutral on the desirability of a referendum, but it correctly insists that the mechanism of decision-making by majority vote on this issue needs to be respected. The report categorically rules out the requirement of any kind of supermajority, describing this as a clear breach of the Good Friday Agreement, which, the report points out, was, and I quote, unequivocal that the threshold in a referendum on the unification question in Northern Ireland would be a simple majority, 50% plus one, of those casting a valid ballot. I have a second point to make more briefly about the report's interpretation of the Good Friday Agreement's provision that Irish unity can only come about by, and I quote, consent, freely and concurrently given, North and South. Does concurrently imply simultaneously? The report concludes that it does not, drawing attention to alternative meanings of this word. So it indicates that concurrently may mean going on side by side. It may mean acting in conjunction with each other, or it may simply mean acting consistently. However, the provision on concurrent consent is carried over verbatim into the Good Friday Agreement from Section 4 of the Downing Street Declaration of 1993, which sought to find an appropriately ambiguous formula for applying the principle of self-determination in Ireland. This would point in the direction of simultaneous referendums that could be presented as a single All-Ireland one. In another thoughtful document produced just before the UCL interim report late last year, the civic nationalist group Ireland's Future argued that concurrently indeed implied that referendums be held simultaneously in the two jurisdictions. Following the approach adopted in the 1998 referendums on the Good Friday Agreement itself. In short, the UCL report, though itself neutral on the Irish unity question, has made a major political contribution, and it has rescued a central plank of the Good Friday Agreement, the principle of a simple majority unity referendum, from erosion to the point of disappearance. Thanks, Cathy.
Thanks so much, Sean. And again, I think we'll come back in the panel discussion to the issue of terminology that maybe has been underanalyzed in the past and not sufficiently well examined. And you're right to point to that different view around what concurrently may or may not mean. There are other terms and turns of phrase that have been used as well: external impediment, rigorous impartiality, and the definitional imprecision of those key terms is something that maybe we'll come back to in the discussion, so you can have a think about that. But for now, I'll pass over to Sarah.
Thanks, Kathy, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. It was a very interesting report, and obviously I give evidence to yourselves when you were in Belfast as well, so it's a pleasure to be able to speak today. Obviously, I'm a unionist. I'm not in favour of a United Ireland. I don't particularly want one to happen, but I do enjoy talking about these things, and I do like thinking about these things, and I'm glad that somebody is thinking about the process of a border poll and everything else. I think this is a hugely significant report. I do think it will be referred to in future by governments and people making decisions, because I haven't read something this substantive in a very long time. But when I was reading it, I recently got Susan McKay's book on Northern Protestants, and in that she spoke to Sammy Douglas, who was ex-DUP, and he surmised that he could live peacefully in United Ireland, but it was the process was worse. The process of getting United Ireland would be worse than actually getting a United Ireland. And I think that made me, I thought of that while I was reading this. So I think, like John, I'll talk about a few things just that I find, very interesting. And I think process for me really is the biggest thing that I took away from this. I think the report clarified some things that I'd already thought myself, but it also made me think about lots of other different things. So, first of all, I'm a lawyer. The legal basis for calling a border poll is something that is constantly talked about. And what this report makes clear is that the Secretary of State has two powers. So, he can call a discretionary border poll, or he can call a mandatory one. And at this point in time, it doesn't look like a mandatory poll is likely. And I think really the risk at the moment is the discretionary poll. Though I think what was interesting in this report is how it clarified that the rigorous impartiality clause would have to be abided by, in the sense that the Secretary of State could not just call a poll to secure the union or to secure United Ireland. He would have to be very careful about that. And indeed, when I often write and talk about border polls, I think a discretionary border poll is the one that I fear the most, because I think of the reasons for the Secretary of State for doing that, I think, would be questioned. I think it could be legally challenged. I think if a discretionary border poll was called and it was not seen to be legitimate, I think it would be boycotted. I think it could cause significant political upheaval. But I think the risk is that one could be called. It doesn't seem likely at any point, but that some nefarious Secretary of State could perhaps call one. It could cause a lot of chaos. And I do think the mandatory poll, I think it assumes that a majority is likely anyway, which makes things a little bit easier. So for me, the discretionary poll is something that I definitely fear. But in terms of process, I think obviously the big issue was the one that John was talking about, which is the majority voting. And I think this is the issue that I think a lot of people will be focusing on. And, the report is right, legally speaking, and it's built into the Northern Ireland Act, it's 50+1. That is what is legally required to call a border poll. It's 50+1 to leave the union, it's 50+1 to stay in the union. But I do think that there's a difference between what is legally required and what is aspirational. And certainly, I think, for anybody who doesn't want this and who wants this, I think ideally we would hope that if it did happen, that it would happen with a very large majority. And I do think that while obviously you can't change the legal conditions, I do think that ideally you would have a lot of people buying into the process, and that if it was 51% to leave the union, there would need to be a lot of work done to provide consent and make unionists and loyalists and people who didn't vote for the United Ireland, to make them feel welcome. And that's a huge fear of mine. And I do think, as I said, I don't think we can change the legal ramifications. I do think it is worth talking about how, if it was to happen, how we could make people follow the process, and how, if a new state had to be formed, that it would be done peacefully. And I do think there's a fear that if it wasn't done peacefully, that it would be an absolute disaster. I thought the most pointed part of the report was when the authors talked about the trade-off, and Alan talked about that at the start of the speech, which is the trade-off between inclusivity and informed choice. I think it's very, very difficult. And I think, the authors noted themselves that I think one aspect of this report, which was disappointing, but I think understandable, but there wasn't a lot of unionist input into the report. When the survey was carried out, there wasn't a lot of unionists that responded to that survey. And I think that's understandable, because for unionists, you don't want a United Ireland, you don't really want to talk about it. And I understand that myself. There are times where I think to myself, I'm maybe talking about United Ireland more than I'm talking about the union at times. But I do think that is understandable. And I wrote about this in the Telegraph recently, though. I think we have to accept, and I think people who want United Ireland have to accept, the unionists are not going to be wanting to talk about these things because for many reasons, to be seen to talk about it can make it seem more likely. It can make it seem like it's about to happen. That could influence public opinion. But I do think there's a difference between political unionists, who I think there's a huge issue for them in talking about this topic, and civic unionists like myself. I can do whatever I want. It's no scratch off my back. I can have a wee chat with anybody. But I do hope that people in unionism are reading this report and looking at its conclusions on what the report says. And to go back to process, one aspect of this report that I did like was the suggestion of 2 referendums. So the idea that there would be a vote on the interim plans for United Ireland and then a later vote on the makeup of it. I think I quite like that idea. I think for unionists who are maybe reluctant to talk about United Ireland, that would actually allow them to feed into the process at a later date, because the report does make clear, if the second referendum failed, the first would still stand. But I think that would allow unionists to engage in this process without feeling like they're turkeys voting for Christmas, to use a common phrase. So I think there's a lot in this to think about. I think there are things in here for unionism to think about, but I do think, we do need to accept that this is going to be difficult for unionists to have a conversation about.
Thank you, Sarah, and you've raised some important questions there around unionist engagement that I'll maybe ask the other panelists to talk to as well in our discussion. Thanks very much. Avla, I'll pass over to you now.
Thanks very much, Cathy, and good evening. And I want to thank the team who drew up this impressive and very detailed report for the invitation to join you in this launch. I welcome the work that's gone into the report and the efforts made to engage in consultation. And I was part of the discussions around the release of the interim report. So I feel the staged approach that the team took has been very productive. The report, as has been said, is not an easy read, but its attention to detail, I think, is really important. As Sarah sort of referred to, there are, I know, those who feel that any mention of a unification referenda is effectively selling the pass concerning future constitutional options for these islands. However, I think that if the Brexit referendum taught us anything, it's the importance of paying attention to the details of electoral choice. And the reality is whether and how potential referenda are designed and formatted has implications for the framing of electoral outcomes. Technical and procedural questions and issues may not set the imagination alight, but they're extremely important. And actually, I remember the Women's Coalition actually tried to raise the issue around different electoral systems during the negotiations for the Good Friday Agreement, but unfortunately we were in a minority. But there's questions, for example, about who has a vote in a future referendum, particularly if we're talking about a number of years in the future. Given that, for example, 16 and 17-year-olds will have to live with the consequences of any potential constitutional change longer than people like me, should they have the right to vote? That's the sort of thing that needs sorted out in advance, not in the immediate lead up to a referenda. Like John, I also welcome the grounding of this report firmly in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement that was accepted by the majority of people voting north and south in the 2 concurrent referenda in 1998. While there's been some debate, I know, and it's been referred to, about the perceived shortcomings of the binary choice between Northern Ireland remaining part of the UK or becoming part of United Ireland, it is clearly stated in the agreement that it's a 50% plus 1 decisive majority vote, similar actually to the 2016 Brexit referendum in the UK. And as the report states up front, the basic question of sovereignty is decided by simple majority. However, to my mind, this is the skeleton that we need to be working with. What is then needed is the creativity and inclusivity that Sarah referred to in the ideas about how we put flesh on that skeleton. The fleshing out of the governance and type of society that we want to live in, and which reflects the ethos of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, including space and recognition for different cultures and identities, as well as being rights-based. The report usefully touches, I think, on some of these issues, including adapting the architecture of the Irish government and governance to accommodate the various traditions within Northern Ireland, if unification is ever to go ahead. And as someone who's originally from the South, but's lived and worked in Northern Ireland since 1975, I believe that much more work needs to be done in the Republic about the implications of any constitutional change. And I know there's initiatives like Aaron's, the Analysing and Researching North and South project, There are preparing research papers on various issues, but this needs to be accompanied by a much more inclusive and open-ended popular discussion that can both suggest and examine options. And over the years, I have been acutely aware about the level of disengagement in the South about Northern Ireland that's often viewed as cantankerous, disruptive, and sometimes bluntly as embarrassing. Probably much the same reaction as you get in Surrey. So it's crucial, I feel, that is the discussion on a possible referendum configurations should be looked at in more detail and looked at as much in the South as hopefully in the North. I think I welcome the quite lengthy discussion of this in the report about different possible referendum configurations, particularly in the context of the sort of binary choice that is to be presented. From reading them, as far as possible, I sort of favor almost like a negotiate the path between the maximum plan scenario, where you work things out as far as possible in advance, but taking Sarah's point of then the need perhaps to get latter engagement in terms of perhaps the unionist population in the North, that an interface with the suggested process plan to outline the shape of any new constitutional and societal offer. People deserve an informed choice when they are voting, particularly to avoid, as we've seen, disinformation, misinformation, and scaremongering. But also to open up a conversation about how potential future governance should be informed by the principles and ethos of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. There's also a need for a greater degree of positive thinking, I think, around the benefits of Northern Ireland remaining within the United Kingdom to balance the arguments in our binary choice scenario. And again, to my mind, unionism and loyalism has been badly served in this regard, although there are some indications that this discussion is starting to happen. But an increasingly English dictated version of the United Kingdom is limited in taking account of priorities for unionists in Northern Ireland, let alone in Scotland or Wales. The need to think creatively about future arrangements will need to address the Belfast Good Friday Agreement's commitment to retain the British identity of people who so designate. But it could also look at greater regional decision-making, at reconfiguring the second chamber of the Senate, at a constitutional review along the lines of initiatives like the current Chilean Constitutional Convention, which interestingly at the moment is going ahead, made up of 50% women and includes voices from indigenous peoples as well. And to this end, reference in the report to the possible contribution of examples of participative democracy and deliberative assemblies, people's assemblies, I think are welcome for perhaps just exploring ideas without the constraints of party political sort of doctrines or disciplines. The delivery of a rights-based approach, as outlined in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, could be strengthened by the development of the Charter of Rights that we were promised actually in that agreement for the island of Ireland. And actually, this is the sort of thing that can start discussion around a range of issues, and this doesn't have to wait for any future referenda. Finally, I think that I support the 5 basic principles suggested for evaluating the referenda processes. However, again, like Sarah, I recognize the challenge of achieving full inclusivity when some see even discussion of theoretical options as threatening. But then, as Aristotle was reported as saying, I can't guarantee it, that is the mark of an educated man, or indeed woman, to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. And looking forward over the next period of time, I'm reminded of the Chinese proverb that when the winds of change blow, some people build walls and others build windmills. So I think the report can actually contribute to a discussion around the windmills.
Thank you, Avila. There's so much in there that we can pick up on in our discussion, not least you made reference on a number of occasions to the need for creativity and inclusivity, so we'll come back to that, but also something that you said around who would have a vote in a referendum. We'll maybe pick up with Alan on the challenges of parallel referendums in 2 jurisdictions and what that would mean then in terms of who has the vote. But before we come to that, I'll pass over finally to Patrick for your opening remarks. Patrick.
Well, good evening and thank you very much for having me. feel obviously a bit daunting to follow such coherent and developed contributions from the other panelists. I'm basically just here in Westminster to pose a series of questions, really, because obviously this is a serious, considered piece of work. Everything, all the praise the other panelists have offered for the report, I wholeheartedly repeat, not least because there is a paucity of such thinking going on in Westminster. And obviously so much of this report is predicated on how a Secretary of State interprets the criteria, which is a gaping hole in any debate over this constitutional issue. At no point have Downing Street or the NAO ever indicated that they'll ever publish this set of criteria, mainly because I don't think they are ready or equipped to consider that question for all the reasons that this report sets out so well. And so this level of detail is completely lacking in discussions within the UK government. And obviously that lack of serious engagement, or that unwillingness to engage seriously and in depth for a number of reasons, be they political, and also there are, this is almost the Cinderella. I know it won't feel that way to people in Northern Ireland of either tradition, but this in a way is almost the Cinderella of the constitutional debates preoccupying Westminster after Brexit and the union with Scotland. But that entire, all that criticism aside, that taking that on board is quite important, because as well as having a Northern Ireland Secretary, a Northern Ireland office, a government that is disengaged with the detail, you have perhaps for the longest time in the past few decades, one that's muscular and unapologetic in its unionism, as is relevant to Northern Ireland, which makes it incredibly tricky and makes these questions, for instance, external impediment, as something that's come up a couple of times. And a reasonable reading of that would be: does that preclude the Northern Ireland Secretary from any of the five, or rather any of the three scenarios set out, or the three workable referendum options? But when you have a Northern Ireland Secretary, obviously he made some interesting comments in the Sunday Times over the weekend, talking about his admiration for Doug Beattie, turning the screws on the DUP vis-a-vis Stormont. When you have a Northern Ireland Secretary who has a clear constitutional objective, which he doesn't really differ from any or very few Northern Ireland secretaries in that regard, has a clear constitutional preference, but is also interfering, implies again a degree of illegitimacy, and that's something I don't want to do. But when that Northern Ireland Secretary is pursuing a course of action in the politics of Northern Ireland, to do so, at what point can he or she set out the criteria by which we're going to call border poll is going to be called, be it any of the models here? What does external impediment mean for GB-based campaigners? Because obviously this has become a touchstone issue for the government, in a way that it hasn't been for the past governments. This government is determined to be much more interventionist. I was reading some government papers before that was talking about Northern Ireland as an integral part of the UK, which obviously isn't that radical it's not a radical or a legitimate thing to say, of course, but this government's interpretation of it is a marked departure from recent governments past. So anybody, and that's something worth considering. I think that's something we have to bring to bear in our discussion of the contents of the report. A couple of other thoughts I had. I was particularly interested in the transfer of sovereignty models discussed, and I think that's again something people in Westminster haven't considered, the idea of unification before agreeing the process. But I think it's worth considering how hapless and maladroit efforts to ever agree a process mediated or refereed by the NAO tend to be, and whether a government again that's so invested in political unionism and is unashamedly attempting to shape political unionism in its own image, whether that government is particularly equipped or suitable to be mediating or agreeing that process. I think it's an open question. Obviously, governments in Westminster change, but I think any discussion of the many considered and robust proposals in the report has to take that political context into account. And I think a lot of these proposals do sort of run up against the wall of, well, actually, what if a government is, what if this government is unequipped, unprepared by reasons of politics and temperament to consider any of these questions, not necessarily in good faith? Does the government have the ability to do that? I was also very interested in the question John raised about the question of agreeing things concurrently. Again, how do we get to this point under this particular government that's distracted by other constitutional questions is an important one. And yeah, I guess to close, I would point to there's an article in the Irish Times today. I think it's by John Doyle talking about the need to move the debate on from discussion of the economic debate on from questions of subvention, actually just making assumptions about actually, well, the UK is paying the pensions of on a reciprocal basis the pensions affected by Brexit. To what extent do those assumptions derail this very sound theoretical basis you've laid out for quite novel ways to consider these questions? For instance, the transfer of sovereignty before the process is agreed. At what point do actually some of these assumptions make the processes laid out in there impossible? And indeed, if the transfer of sovereignty one is the one I keep coming back to, because I think there's something very seductive and enticing about that proposal, but I do wonder whether actually the process there is so much to gum up that process, even if a vote does go one way or the other. But yes, I guess that wasn't particularly coherent, but I guess I'm coming this as a perspective from as a person who talks to some of the people who on this side might be entrusted to grapple with these questions and put the UK case to Dublin and to the parties in Northern Ireland. Frankly, I don't see or don't hear much evidence beyond trying to preclude this question from ever arising and the refusal to lay out when asked the criteria is a case in point. But when should that criteria appear to have been sort of self-evidently fulfilled, it's worth considering whether there is a government here equipped to grapple with these questions. And obviously that's the key difference with Dublin, where you have ongoing work on these questions. The political culture is much more equipped, for various reasons, to work on this stuff seriously. And I think any desire for a smooth, consensual transition or any agreement on a process has to reckon with this government in particular, but two, those key differences in political culture. And as much as I, greatly admire the work done, I'd say I'd be much more pessimistic about the grounds for consensus, not because of the merit of the proposals laid out, just because of the deficiencies I've just discussed.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and certainly your observation that Northern Ireland is the Cinderella of the constitutional debate, vis-a-vis what Avla has said in terms of much more work needing to be done in the Republic, and the disengagement in the South is again something we can pick up on. Thanks to everybody for all of your introductory remarks. You've raised lots of important questions. You've expressed preferences for certain things. I have lots of questions. Our audience already have been sending in lots of questions, but I wanted to give you the opportunity first to reflect a little bit on anything that you've heard from your co-panelists. I'm particularly interested to hear your thoughts on what might come next. This has been a fairly lengthy piece of work, and there are 3 configurations on the table. Alan, I'll start with you. What do you think will happen next?
Happily, it's not my job to answer that question, so I'm very intrigued to hear the answers to that from the other four panelists. Can I maybe just clarify a few things in the report that a number of people, a number of you talked about there, just for the benefit of people in the audience. So one point is on the referendum configurations. So Sarah mentioned the idea of a two referendum process, and what Sarah said there was entirely correct, but I just wanted to reiterate what we say just to ensure that it's clear. So it's very clear from the agreement that one referendum is all that is required in order to decide the issue, the sovereignty question. So, we don't suggest, which has sometimes been floated, that there is a referendum first on the principle of unification and later on a referendum, if that passes, on whether to go ahead or not once the detail has been worked out. That is not compatible with the agreement. But we do allow for the possibility in some of the referendum configurations that there could be a referendum on the principle, and then later there is a further referendum on the form that unification will take, but where whatever the outcome of that second referendum, unification does take place. The second referendum is about the form of that. And perhaps I should also just, because several people mentioned just the names of the configurations and so on, I should just clarify that. So there are basically three approaches that you could take to this referendum. One would be to have no plan in place as to what would follow a vote for unification if that were to happen. So no plan for the form of a united Ireland, and also no plan for the process of developing the form of a united Ireland. And we're very clear that that would not be desirable. And it's a point that was made to us by many people on all sides in our discussions. Don't repeat the Brexit process. Whatever you think of Brexit itself, don't repeat the process of going into it without a plan. At the opposite extreme is what Avila quite correctly referred to as the maximum plan, to use our terminology, where a plan for the United Ireland is worked out so far as it can be before the referendum, and that the constitutional amendments to put that into place are being voted on at the same time in the South as the unification question. And then intermediate is the option of what we refer to as the process plan, where the plan for United Ireland has not been worked out, but the process for developing that plan has been worked out. And one of those possible processes is what Patrick was referring to there, where unification takes place and then on interim terms, and then there is a process of working out the permanent form of a United Ireland. Or alternatively, a referendum takes place, there's a vote for unification, supposing there's a vote in favour of unification. Then there is a period before unification of working out the detail, and unification would take place only after that. And I'll be very interested to hear, Sarah was offering some thoughts on which of these might be best in order to ensure an inclusive process. Avila was suggesting that maybe there's a way of combining bits of the maximum plan and bits of the process plan. And I guess I'm quite sympathetic to that idea. These configurations look very clear in the abstract, but if you actually start thinking about how they would work in practice, then it's quite easy to see that they would tend to merge into each other a bit. That borrowing from the maximum plan model, it seems very likely, whatever formal plan process is followed, that there would be a lot of work done developing the options for a United Ireland and proposals on and which options might be favoured. But you don't necessarily have to make that decision before a referendum takes place. So I think you're right that there are ways of seeing a path through this that are slightly less stark than the initial choice that we've suggested. Sorry, I've spoken too much already. There's much more that I could pick up from those really interesting contributions, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alan. Colleagues, anything that you'd like to add? Sarah, you had a preference for one of the configurations. Is there anything that you've heard that persuades you otherwise, that hybrid model maybe?
Again, yes, and I have to go back and look exactly, because I know there was two different hybrids, wasn't there? There was one that was a wee bit more detailed, a bit more lengthy, I think, than the other. But I did like the idea. I mean, obviously, I don't want United Ireland, but I do think, you know, the big concern is if it happens, you know, you're going to need the input of unionists and loyalists and others, you know, who are going to find it very difficult to talk about it, even right up to a campaign. And there's many different ways that they can get involved. You know, I like the idea that the Secretary of State might call a poll, and then it might actually happen 3 years later, which would allow for a lot of things to happen in the interim. And maybe you could have an open process where both sides would talk about what they would like in terms of the Union and United Ireland. But equally, I like the idea that if a vote does happen, that there would be a further process for people to feed into, and at that point they would probably feel a lot more doing so. So I just generally, I quite like that idea. I think it would allow people to engage a lot more than they would have to under a different plan.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Sarah. I know that I said I wouldn't stifle the conversation amongst you, but Conor, I know our audience have been patiently waiting on having their questions answered, and you've been busy collecting these into categories of similar questions. So maybe we'll take 2 or 3 per round to put to the panelists, and they can choose which they'll answer, and we'll do a couple of rounds of these for the next 20 minutes or so. So Conor, over to you.
Yep. Hi, everyone. We've had lots of interesting questions come in. The first round are all to do with the threshold and 50% plus 1. So Irene Newton asks, does the 50% mean 50% of the eligible voting population, or 50% of those who actually vote on the day? So a technical question. John Newham then asks, does the experience of the Brexit referendum not underline the shortcomings of relying on 50% plus 1? And finally, Rory Montgomery asks, how do moderate nationalists, both North and South, square the simple majority requirement of the agreement with strong public disquiet, as evidenced in opinion polls, at the idea of change affected by 50% plus 1, which is at odds with the long-standing philosophy of persuasion and consensus?
All great questions. John, I'll maybe start with you, since you began your opening remarks on the issue of the qualified majority argument and the report's view on that.
Well, I think the 50% plus 1 clearly refers to the voters who turn out, not to the electorate, not a percentage of the electorate. On the more general point of decision-making by referendum, to combine the answer to that with an answer to an earlier issue raised by Alan, it seems to be vital that, as we've learned from Brexit, that a relatively detailed blueprint of what Irish unity might look like needs to be drawn up before there's any vote. It seems to me that it would be a big mistake to rush into a vote on Irish unity until this had been done. And it's hard to overestimate the amount of work required to draw up such a detailed blueprint. Even to draw up a sketch of what Irish unity might look like would be enormously demanding. There are a whole range of questions in a whole range of areas that need to be addressed, such as, for example, the financial implications of this. John Doyle addressed just some of these. A very interesting op-ed in the Irish Times today. Cultural issues such as flags, anthems, symbols, state rituals, commemorative ceremonies, historical myths, the status of the Irish language, and institutional, the most important of all, arguably, institutional design. What would a United Ireland look like constitutionally? So it seems to me that these kind of questions need to be addressed first before there is any poll. A poll is some way down the road, and the kind of concerns that people have might well be laid as part of the discussion of these various possibilities and the various kind of modalities of reaching Irish unity and the kind of shape that an United Irish state would take.
And Patrick, on the Brexit element of the question, did we learn the lesson from Brexit on the merits of 50% plus 1 or otherwise?
Well, Brexit isn't necessarily the referendum I would return to on the question of a qualified majority. If we're looking at returning, I think everybody would agree if the border poll does happen, it needs to be command broad public consent. Obviously, there will be a minority, however big, who disagree with the principle and the legitimacy of it. But let's say there any poll could or would command, in an ideal world, the broad consent. Obviously, it would depend on the process of the electorate. But if you introduce qualified majority elements of that, then the hangover of the process will be long, particularly if, as in Scotland in 1979, you have a majority of the electorate turning out on the day saying, yes, I'm in favour of unification, and then a threshold that seems to be, as the report says, a sort of safety valve in favour of the status quo. At that point, I feel you might get into quite dangerous territory, even in terms of faith in the democratic process, and the ability to continue discussions over unification as a live constitutional issue, as one assumes it would be if the Secretary of State's threshold has been met. I just sort of feel that toxifies the debate. So I think, as it sort of did in Scotland, it became the nationalist central to the nationalist sort of mythos was that Scotland's chance of self-determination had been stolen from it, and sort of set back any rational debate on devolution for quite some time. But a sort of more relevant point of Brexit is what John just said about talking about detailed blueprints. And again, this is where Brexit and Scotland are relevant, because, okay, say naturally, everybody who's party to this question, obviously there are some things that are objective but can't be disputed, but even economic projections are, to a certain extent, particularly after Brexit and the Scottish referendum, are always going to be in the minds of the electorate freighted with perceptions of bias and partiality, even if they are those projections are as independent and rigorously put together as can be. And obviously, for every independent report into the economic factors of any question, there'll always be my apologies if he's on the call, but there'll always be a Patrick Minford, i.e. the economist for Brexit chap, willing to say, actually, no, the exact opposite. This question that 50 economists are saying is terrible is actually brilliant. And that's something to consider, I think. No matter how much buy-in or how developed a framework you develop, particularly for questions of, okay, let's see if we can agree a process or we can agree the shape of this thing, everybody will always be able to find their own expert. You see this with the pandemic, you have sage and independent sage. So I think something to consider, and that's, I feel, as was the case in the Brexit debate, as Number 10 and the Remain campaign found out to their cost. These things in the minds of the electorate aren't always as robust and objective as you hope they will be, or as the amount of expertise and evidence at your disposal suggests they might be.
Thanks, Patrick. And of course, the last question from Rory Montgomery chimes, Sarah, with your opening remarks around the difference between the legal requirement and what's aspirational. Conor, do you want to remind us of that question again, just so that we have the right wording there?
Certainly. It's how do moderate nationalists, both north and south, square the simple majority requirement of the agreement with strong public disquiet, as revealed in polls, at the idea of change affected by 50% plus one, which is at odds with the long-standing philosophy of persuasion and consensus?
So it's that philosophy of persuasion and consensus. Maybe Sarah and Avla, if you want to both pick up on that.
Do you want me to go first? Yeah, it's a question I've thought about a lot, and you can't get around the fact that 50 plus one it's built in the Northern Ireland Act, if particularly from a mandatory border poll, the Secretary of State has to call it as if United Ireland appears, a majority would vote for it. I mean, the majority is 50 plus one. I was at a Slugger event a couple of years ago, and somebody from the DUP was talking openly at the panel, and he said, 50 plus one focuses the minds of people. And there are some people involved in this debate, I think, who just want to shift the goalposts. I think they just want to get the number up, and because they don't want to have to do any work. There are other people, I think, who are, when they talk about raising the threshold, they quite genuinely care about making a United Ireland and making it a United Ireland for everyone, making sure that many people aren't as bored as possible. But there are pros and cons either way. I mean, with the threshold, somebody had suggested 70%. I mean, are we saying if 60% of people want to leave and join the South, that would be stability for Northern Ireland? It's such a difficult question. and it could further inflame tensions and everything else. So, you know, it's not really for me to say what is right. I don't think you can get past the law on this, that it's 50+1. I think it will have to be 50+1. But I do think, talking to people, that anybody that I've talked to that does want a United Ireland, you know, they would hope for more than that, and they know ideally that if it was to happen, people would hope that it would happen with as highest a majority as possible. So I think it's going to have to be an ongoing conversation. But I would say that, look, even if it is legally 50+1, I do think it's still worth talking about how to make, if United Ireland does happen, how to get as many people on board with it, and to talk about building consensus into the process at some point, because it could be disastrous if we don't, I think.
And Avila, I can see you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with Sarah. I mean, I'm just very loath to start cherry picking the agreement, the international agreement, because where do you stop, basically? And it's one of the reasons why I raised the thing about the Charter of Rights for the island of Ireland, which is in the agreement and hasn't been implemented. You know, and actually, looking back, I think one of the things that we probably did wrong around the agreement was not being clearer about the milestones for implementation. I think everybody heaved such a sigh of relief when we got it, that there was a lot of things that actually weren't thought through, and some of these are coming back to haunt us. But around the consensus, I think that's a really important point, but that has to be worked at. And I don't think actually, as Sarah says, by just trying to move the goalposts, it's actually going to help in terms of that. It just sort of puts it off. And that's why I actually was talking about some sort of an interface between the maximum position in terms of having everything worked out in advance before a people's choice and a process approach. I think what we need to start doing is what is almost like the sufficiency for an informed vote in a sort of a referendum, but then what are the actual other aspects of that could be then discussed in greater detail to try and get consensus through a process. So for argument's sake, I would sort of see as one of the things that you would need to know for an informed voice, well, will Stormont stay? You know, are we really talking about a regional Ireland or you know, things like that, which are fairly meaty. But then you might, but then there might well be other aspects, for example, like drawing up a new constitution for the whole island, which could be more of a process period. And actually you could have a sort of referendum, and then further down the line, almost like a preferendum in terms of a range of different options. And that's where I would see your broader deliberative democracy coming in, and the need for that broader discussion. Because one of the things that I really feel is important is to take the discussion out from the purely party political into broader society, because that's where you're going to get the reaction and the, you know, the unexpected reaction, I think. And just one final point, picking up what was said in terms of time scale and Sammy's quote that Sarah mentioned about, you know, worried about the process. I can see why Sammy said that. I think one of the things that whatever we do in terms of the staging of any change is not to leave long gaps. There is nothing worse in Northern Ireland than a vacuum, because then you start getting the politics of perception and the politics of misrepresentation, you know, and people starting to take positions. I think you need to be very clear to keep the momentum going. And I think that's actually what delivered the Good Friday Agreement.
Thanks, Avila. Okay, Conor, let's have another round of questions.
Okay, so we've had a couple more questions come through. So a couple people have asked about the project and whether or not the report adequately reflects unionist thinking, and does it say enough about a reformed Northern Ireland remaining in the UK? A follow-up to that question was coming from Stephen Dodds. It was, does the panel believe there is a single unionist point of view towards the conversation on the desirability of a united Ireland? And then a question from Emma McArdle, who asks, does the panel think that the Irish government should convene a citizens' assembly to discuss these issues?
Okay, Alan, I'm going to begin with you here. Does the report say enough about staying in the UK, and what was the conversation within the working group about the binary choice of a united Ireland or staying within the UK? Let's start with you.
Yeah, and this project was a project looking at how you would design and conduct a referendum under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement on the unification question. but members of the working group, a number of members of the working group, are working on a range of other possible paths that might be taken in Northern Ireland's future. And I know some are very interested in thinking about possible reforms to the Union and how those could help to diffuse some of the difficult issues that we encounter in our report. So the report doesn't have a view on those other issues. They were simply outside our remit, but we absolutely recognise the importance of other aspects of this conversation. And as Sarah quite rightly alluded to, it was a struggle for us to engage unionist voices in our work. We tried very hard. At the same time, it's entirely legitimate for people to choose not to engage with these questions, which are, of course, very, very difficult questions and questions about processes that people don't want to happen. So, there's no blame from us on that at all. And we certainly never thought that there is a single unionist view on any of these issues, but Sarah will clearly have much more than I have to say about that. Just perhaps a word from me also on the final question about whether the Irish government should convene a citizens' assembly. And Avila has talked about citizens' assemblies as well. I am an enormous advocate personally of citizens' assemblies. I ran the first UK-wide citizens' assembly, which was a citizens' assembly on Brexit in 2017. I'm going to be running another one on democracy in the UK later this year. In this particular circumstance, however, I think we have to be aware of the difficulties of a citizens' assembly. Trying to convene a citizens' assembly on an issue that is so divisive, where there is a significant likelihood that a large part of the community will choose not to take part and will be encouraged potentially by political leaders not to take part, may cause more harm than good. So I completely agree with Avila's point on the importance of engaging the public and encouraging public discourse on these matters. But it may be better to do that through a wide variety of different conversations happening in different places, rather than the Irish government trying to convene one big citizens' assembly, which seems to me likely to become an object of severe criticism from some parts of the debate that would not help its legitimacy.
Struggled with my unmute button there. Thanks very much, Alan. I'd really like this question to be picked up by all of our panelists, if you don't mind, whether you pick up the issue of how to engage with unionism, how whether a citizens' assembly may or may not work, and the piece about the Cinderella of the constitutional debate in the UK and whether or not more needs to be said about possibilities and benefits of staying within the UK in further work. So a comment from each of you, if you don't mind. I'll begin with Avila.
Okay, in terms of the citizens' assemblies, I take Alan's point. I mean, to have a citizens' assembly of United Ireland is too much of a mouthful, basically, and clearly you're not going to get inclusion from people that don't identify with that possibility. But I think what you could usefully have over a period is to break down that what's the type of society that actually we're signing up to. I mean, if you're, I've been at discussions in Belfast and elsewhere over the last while, and people are sort of saying, well, what's the health service? What's the educational situation? So there are actually issues around, women sort of say, what's the sort of the gender dimension. And I know there is a sort of project in University of Ulster at the moment in terms of women's voice, in terms of the constitutional future. So there are ways, I think, of doing it to actually start a discussion, not just of the formalities of governance, so that's really important, but what is the type of society? And what do we mean when we're talking about a charter of rights? You could certainly have citizens' assemblies or deliberative, democracy initiatives around that sort of thing. But that creates, I suppose, more of a flow of discussion that it perhaps can be somewhat more inclusive than if you're asking people, do we do away with the border or not? Yeah, I agree with that, and I don't think it works on that. because people will go back into their respective boxes. One thing that I actually am fascinated about, and there's quite little information, that for all the opinion polls that I've been looking at over the last couple of years around some of the constitutional issues, there is this block of sort of 20% in the middle who actually either don't know or are not convinced or whatever. And actually, I would love to see some exercise that starts exploring with them. And my reckoning is actually that they're quite often the younger population who you know, and certainly the sort of change initiative that I work for, we've done some attitude studies recently on different aspects. And again, there's this block of under 35s who are basically saying, we're fed up with this constitutional debate. We're interested in rights, in health service, in the welfare system, whatever else. So there's ways of getting that discussion going about what society could look like. In terms of unionism, I certainly, from the unionists that I know, are people that would seek to maintain the union with Britain. There's a whole range of different views. And I think it's actually been reflected in some of the work that Pete Shirlow has been doing in the Institute of Irish Studies in Liverpool University, where again, he's reflected a whole range of views. I mean, all too often, we basically sort of see those that are just sort of saying, no way, you know, over our dead bodies. But I distinguish between people who don't see these referenda and a change in constitutional situation as desirable. But there are some that would say, but if at the end of the day it's happening, it's acceptable. So it's between those that see it as potentially acceptable and those that actually say, no, it is completely non-acceptable and we're going to pack our bags and leave or whatever. You know, so there's a whole spectrum there. And, you know, and I think that sort of that sort of almost even internal discussion within unionism and loyalism needs to be given more space, because there's also, you know, a growing amount, I think, of civic unionism who actually are looking for a more progressive liberal society. And, you know, and where do they find that? And that's why I link that back to sort of discussion around the type of society we have. Because to be quite honest, I think a lot of people are looking over to what Patrick described in terms of what's been created in England. And it's not particularly attractive to people that have any sort of progressive values.
Okay, let's have a quick word then from Sarah, from Patrick, and then from John on this set of questions. We're running fast out of time, so brevity's key here, folks.
Okay. I think there was a question, does the report say enough about the union and within the UK? It doesn't, you know, but I do, and it is a topic I think I would like to talk about a lot. You know, I would like to talk about more about Northern Ireland within the union and making the union better. I would like to talk about other options on the ballot. That's something I think I'm quite interested in itself. I don't think there's a single unionist view on anything. Take 10 unionists in a room, they'll all fight with each other and break up and go off and form different groups. In terms of engaging with unionism, I do think, you know, it's a difficult one. I think people are just going to have to accept that unionists are not going to engage in, some unionists will just not engage in this topic. But I would caution that I think people who do want United Ireland need to be aware that, you know, by talking to the unionists that say the nice things to you and say the right things, that's not how you're going to do this. This is going to be difficult and you're going to have to accept that going forward. You're not going to just talking to the ones who turn up and smile at you and say, oh yes, this is all grand. No, it can't, you know, we can't be doing that. I do think there's a conversation to be had about, you know, I think as you know, Avril was saying about, you know, about progressive societies and this type of thing. Though, you know, as I said, from the unionist perspective, you know, it's Tories to the right and Tories to the left, as far as I'm concerned. With Northern Ireland, there's Tories down south and there's Tories across the water and the way, and there's no really good option that way. But that is just my view. But I think these are difficult questions, and I think it's a lot more conversations need to be had. But I think unionism needs to have conversations with itself as well outside of this topic, and I think that's really where their focus needs to be at this point in time.
Thanks, Sarah. Patrick?
Yeah, at the risk of sounding like a stuck record, I think obviously it's very easy to talk about how unionism needs to have a discussion with itself and that the onus is on people to decide what they find acceptable, etc., etc. It's also incumbent upon the British government, should this process be triggered, any of the processes set out in the report, it would be incumbent on the British government, which is why I sort of think discussing citizens' assemblies in Dublin is part of the answer, but I think a much smaller one than perhaps perhaps other members of the panel would say, because ultimately the answer to the question that the contours of the debate in the unionist community, the answer members of the unionist community will give it, and indeed some members of the minority of the nationalist community, may well be predicated upon what is the shape of the British government's obligation and the future of the devolution settlement as established in multi-party talks within the UK. The parameters, what the British government says about that will be important, and indeed the spirit in which the British government approaches those debates. Because again, if we're still being run by a government that sees not merely its preference but its responsibility to uphold the union, then who am I to say that? And look, I could, we don't have time to go into the attitudes of British ministers towards the NIO. Sinn Féin appeasement department is how one veteran of that department used to put it. But it's whether those questions are approached in good faith. Is there an attempt to turn the screws on people flirting with the United Ireland, or perhaps countenancing unity that wouldn't before by giving unsatisfactory answers to those questions as to the continued obligation of the British government to British citizens and others in Northern Ireland. So I think that's worth considering, and I think that's almost the missing. It's very easy to talk about. Well, it's not easy actually. Sorry, that sounded like I was dismissing the work of the report, but I'm not. It's sort of the really difficult bit is second guessing how a government that has not engaged in this question, doesn't think it's its job to engage in this question, doesn't want to engage in this question, and frankly, to a large extent, can't engage in this question. That'll have not just an impact on the process, but also the conversations that happen, I think, and the parameters of the conversations that happen within and across communities, I would say.
Thank you. John, before I come to you, I'm going to go back to Conor very quickly here. Conor, do you have any technical type questions in your box there? Because I'd like to bring both John Coakley and Alan Renwick in to mop up those technical difficult questions as well as the macro level questions. Have you got anything there that we can give to our panelists just as a last one or two?
Yep, we have a couple of procedural questions, which we love at the Constitution Unit. The first is on the franchise. So does the panel see it as problematic that only Irish citizens can vote in the Republic, but in the UK, British, Irish and Commonwealth citizens can vote? That came from Chris Tavender. Then Rosalind Kerr asks, who would have the final say on ratifying the process after the referendums, presumably if they voted for unification? And then a final question. The EU referendum of 1975 was overturned by the EU referendum of 2016. Does the panel believe that the people of Northern Ireland retain in perpetuity the right to overturn a future vote in favour of unification?
That question's resonating with Sarah, but John, I'll come to you first on this one and then pass over to Alan.
Yeah, to go back to the earlier question, if I may,
yes.
would it be a good idea to have some kind of deliberative body to look at blueprints for Irish unity? The answer to this, I think, is yes, that we need such a body. Whether it should take the form of a citizens' assembly is another matter. So there's quite a history behind bodies of this kind. So back in the 1980s, we had the New Ireland Forum. This was replaced by the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation in the 1990s. And we could have another body of this kind that would look in very considerable detail at the kind of questions that flow from the issue of Irish unity. These bodies are largely political, of course, but then the questions they're looking at are quintessentially political. Would there be unionist buy-in to this? I suspect not. So these would probably end up as forums essentially for nationalist Ireland, but this nevertheless does not prevent them from doing very, very good work, from making a very, very valuable contribution to debate in this area. On the other technical questions, I'll pass on to Alan.
Super, Alan, over to you.
Thanks very much. So the first question there was on the franchise and whether we think it's a problem that only Irish citizens can vote in the South, whereas the franchise in the North is wider. We looked at those kinds of questions from two perspectives. One, a kind of technical perspective. Is there a technical problem in having differences in the rules between Northern Ireland and the Republic? And also a more kind of principled view around the nature of these votes. We didn't think that there's a technical problem in this case. I mean, sometimes there is a technical problem with having differences in the rules. In this case, we didn't see a technical problem. With regard to how you kind of conceptualize the referendum on this issue. So some people will think of this as the people of Ireland as a whole making a choice, and would therefore have a kind of principled preference for having the same rules applying across the whole island. Whereas for other people, the people of the south are making a choice and the people of the north are making a choice, and these are two separate choices. And presumably there's no principled reason for thinking that the rules need to be the same in Northern Ireland and in the Republic. We look only at the technical stuff. We're focusing on the mechanics. It's for other people to have a view on how in principle they conceptualize this vote, if you like. On the question of who would ratify, so yes, it's quite correct that the outcomes of these referendums would subsequently have to go through the parliaments in both Ireland and the UK. Under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, however, there is an obligation in international law upon both states to implement the outcome. So there would be a violation of that if ratification, to use the word in the question, did not go ahead. Would the people of Northern Ireland retain the right to overturn the result? Well, there's nothing in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement to suggest that those aspects of the framework would be maintained beyond unification, were unification to take place. So beyond that point, you know, people would retain the same democratic rights that anyone has in a democracy, but there isn't a specific provision around that. And just very finally, I'm conscious that Patrick has made really important points about the Westminster dimension on this, and I haven't responded to them at any point. And I think Patrick is absolutely right to raise these fundamental questions. Our point in our report, I guess, is that it is vitally important for the government in Westminster to understand its international obligations here and to understand the dangers of violating those international obligations. And I think we really have to avoid getting into a situation which it's perhaps easy to get into at the present times, of just kind of accepting that governments sometimes violate their obligations. To do so in this case would not just be legally wrong, which is important in itself, but also dangerous, fundamentally dangerous. And we need to warn against that at all costs.
Thank you, Alan. And folks, I'm really sorry. We have gone seriously into overtime here. That was our last round of questions, and that really is all that we have time for, even though we know there's lots more questions in the pot. So on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to thank our panelists for so much food for thought. You've all been brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks also to the Constitution Unit's partners for tonight's event. Tonight's event was jointly hosted with the Democracy Unit at Queen's University Belfast, the Trinity Centre for Constitutional Law and Governance at Trinity College Dublin, the Institute for Governance or for Irish and British Studies at UCD, and the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University. On behalf of all of our panel members of the working group and our panelists here tonight, I'd really like to thank you, our audience, for joining us and for raising such provoking and important questions, and those that we didn't get to deal with in the seminar tonight we'll take away and look at and have a little bit more of a think about. If you haven't read the report, you can find it on the Constitution Unit website, or simply by searching online for Working Group on Unification Referendums on the island of Ireland. And on the website you can also find a really useful 13-page executive summary and a short video about the report if you don't want to read the whole 300 pages. If you're interested in a briefing about the report with members of the working group, or if you've got any questions at all, please do get in touch with Alan or with Connor Kelly. And that is a wrap. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. Take care and enjoy the rest of your night. Goodbye.